Hello and welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to add NGRX data in our Angular application. And using NGRX data, we are going to maintain some entities in our application. But before that, let's first go to our application. And here, let me open Developer Tool and let's go to Redux Dev Toolkit. Here, I want to show you what states we have currently. So we have the auth state, where we have the user state data. We have the shared state, in which we have the shared states like is loading an error message. Then we have the router state for managing the router state data. We have the courses state, and in the courses state you will notice that we only have show form and loaded state. We do not have any course entity here, because in the last lecture when we did cleanup in our project, from there we also removed NGRX entity. So we are not using NGRX entity concept, and because of that you will not see any entities or IDs property here. Now we are going to add entities in our application using NGRX data. So for that, here I have opened the documentation of NGRX data. So to go to the documentation, you can go to ngrx.io. So let me show you. Let's go to ngrx.io. From there, you can go to docs. And in there, if you want to learn about NGRX store, you can go to the state folder, and from there you can go to NGRX store. If you want to learn about NGRX effects, you can select it from here. If you want to learn about NGRX router store, you can select it from here. About NGRX entity, you can select it from here. But here in this lecture and in this section, we want to learn about NGRX data. For that, you have to expand this data folder, and in there you will find the documentation for NGRX data. All right. Now remember that in order to use NGRX data in your application, this NGRX data library, it is dependent on NGRX store, NGRX entity, and NGRX effects. So in order to use NGRX data in your application, you must have these three libraries installed. And we have already installed these three libraries previously in our course. So if I go to package.json file, there you will see that in there we already have NGRX store installed, we have NGRX entity installed, and we have NGRX effects installed. So these three are the required libraries which we need to install in order to work with NGRX data. Once we have these three libraries, now we can also go ahead and install NGRX data. For that, let's go to the installation page, and from there let's copy this ng-add ngrx data command. So this is Angular command. You can also use npm install command to install NGRX data. Let's go to VS Code. Let me close this package.json file. Here I'm going to open VS Code built-in terminal. And there I'm going to type that command which I have just copied from the documentation. And here I want to install the version of NGRX data which is compatible with Angular 16. So here I'm going to install version 16 for NGRX data. Let's press enter and let's wait for this installation to complete. So here it is asking for the confirmation. I'll press Y and I'll press enter, and let's wait for this installation to complete. All right, the installation is complete, and you will see that after this command was successfully executed, it has done three things. First of all, it has updated the package.json file. So if I open package.json file now, there we should have NGRX data added. As you can see, NGRX data is added there. Then what it has also done is it has created a file called entity metadata.ts, and it has created this file in the app folder. So if I expand this source folder in there, if I expand the app folder, there you will see that a new file called entity metadata.ts file has been created. We will look into this file in a bit. And what it has also done is it has updated our app module.ts. So if I go to app module.ts file, there you will see that in the imports, this entity data module has been imported. On that, we are calling this for root method, and using this for root method, we are registering this entity config for the entire application. Now, what is this entity config? This entity config, it is coming from this entity metadata.ts file which has been created. So if I scroll up, you will see that we are importing that entity config from entity metadata file. If I open this entity metadata.ts file, there we have this entity config which we are exporting from this file and which we are registering using this for root method of entity data module. Now let's have a look at this entity metadata.ts file, what we are doing here. So the first thing which we are doing is we are creating an entity metadata constant, and the type for this constant is entity metadata map. This is important. This entity metadata map, this is going to keep all our entities which we are going to use in our Angular application. Currently it is empty, but here we can go ahead and we can add all our entities which we are going to use in our application. So for example, in our application, I'm going to have a course entity, and to that I'm going to assign an empty object. Now here this course, this is not the course type, not the course interface which we have created in the courses module. This is the name of the entity which we want to provide. And the convention is when you provide an entity name, it must start with uppercase letter. And to that we are assigning an object. Inside this object, we can do some configurations for this course entity. So for example, here if I type something like, so you see, you will see some options, some properties which we can set inside this object, like the select ID, the sort comparer. Then we have other properties also which we will talk about. But using this object, we can do some configuration for the entity specific configuration. Okay. Now, the another thing which you need to remember is all the entities of our application, we need to keep it inside this entity metadata. Currently, in my application, I'm using only one entity, which is course. But if you want to have multiple entities, like for example, if you also want to have lesson entity, then that also you can add, and you can assign a configuration object to it. And in there, you can define the configuration for that entity. In the same way, we can also have another entity called post, and to that also we can assign an empty object, or we can assign an object with some configurations for that entity. And we will talk about these configurations in great detail in our coming lectures. But here, while creating entity, you need to remember two things. First of all, your entity name should start with uppercase letter, and it should not be a plural word, like it should not be courses or lessons or posts. Okay. And there is a reason behind that which you will understand in our coming lectures. And if there is any entity whose name in plural is not just adding s, so for example, if I want to make this post plural, I just need to add s after that, so it will become plural. Then if I have course, if I want to make it plural, I just need to add s after that and it will become courses. But if we have an entity with a name something like hero, now in order to make this entity plural, what we need to do, we can't just add s after that to make it plural. Instead, it should be es, right? So if there is any such entity for which, in order to make it plural, we cannot just add s after the entity name, for those type of entities, you need to create another constant. You can call this constant anything, but inside that you need to specify the entity name. So in my case it is hero, and you need to specify the plural word for that entity. So the plural word for this entity will be heroes with es in the end, right? Now you might ask why I'm talking about singular and plural words. As I said, you will understand that in our coming lectures. But if you want to do this type of configuration where you want to specify the plural word for an entity explicitly, you can do that by creating a variable like this. So using the entity metadata, we define all our entities. Now we need to create an entity config. And this entity config should be of type entity data module config. And inside this entity config, we do two things. First, we specify our entity metadata, which contains all the entities of our application. In our case, this is our entity metadata, which contains all the entities of our application. So we need to assign this property with the entity metadata, which we have created. So here, since the name is same, we can avoid explicit assignment. But let's say if the name is different here, something like metadatas, then in that case we will have to do the assignment explicitly like this. Or even if the name is same also, in that case also we can do the explicit assignment, but in that case explicit assignment is not required. Okay, so this entity metadata contains all our entities, so that's why we are assigning it to the entity metadata. Then the second configuration is, if for any entity we are specifying a plural name explicitly, like for this entity, then that we have assigned to a variable. I can call this variable anything, and I need to assign this variable to this plural names property like this. Okay, so here I'm going to get it back, and since the name is same, I don't need to do explicit assignment, but even if I do that, it will not create any issues. Now in my case, I don't want to use this hero entity in my application, so I'll remove this. I also don't want to use this post entity in my application, so I'll also remove this. I'll keep lessons for now, and I'll surely keep this course entity. And since I don't have any entity for which I need to specify the plural word explicitly, I can remove this also. Okay, and I can remove this configuration from here. But this entity metadata configuration, this is mandatory. Here we need to specify the entity metadata, because this is what is going to store all our entities which we are going to use in our application. Currently we have defined two entities, courses and lessons. And now we are exporting this entity config from here, which is storing our entity data module config, and we have registered it in our app module. So basically, using this for root method on this entity module, we have registered it. And with this, if we save the changes and if we go to our application, and there, if we open Redux Dev Toolkit, you will see that a new property called entity cache has been added here. Okay, and this entity cache is going to store all our entities and the current state of those entities. And that we will see in our coming lectures. Now, one thing before I wrap up this lecture, you need to understand that the entities which we have created here, currently it does not know that this course entity should be of type this course model. So somewhere we have created the course model. Here we have the models folder. In there we have this course model. So this course model is the model which we are using for our courses. So currently we have not specified that this course entity should be of type course interface. It should have objects which should have ID, title, description, image, author, and price property. That we are specifying nowhere. That we are going to do in our next lecture. And for that, we need to create a service for this course entity. So that we are going to do in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.